Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I'm Dawn Porter. I am the moderator and a longtime seasonal resident, and I'm really, really delighted to be here and so delighted to have you all here. This is a killer panel. I mean, these folks are so accomplished, and so I would just like to recognize them collectively. We're here today to talk about some of their most recent work, but I think in this age where we are concerned about the truth and about journalism and reporting, the idea that they have dedicated their careers to giving us, the public, real information, I think is something that we should not go unremarked. So I was really excited to be asked and nervous because this panel, to be moderating this. But then, when I realized what the different books were, I felt like it was actually made for me because I am a graduate of Georgetown Law School. I just finished a 4-part series on the Supreme Court and its rightward shift. We go from the Warren Court to the current court. I hope you'll all watch. And I'm a girl. So I thought, well, this was for me that they put this together. But I want to stop and think about how these books are in conversation with each other. We've got 2 books that dive deep into the Supreme Court, one on the history of one of our nation's most preeminent institutions and its relationship to slavery. And then another about women scientists, but also discrimination against women generally, and women's continuing fight for full equality. So I wanted to actually talk about how all these books are in conversation together. And I thought if you all want to comment on that at some point, that would be great. But I think I want to start with Michael Waldman and talk about your book. So first, could you just tell us, I think we have a sense of this, but I wonder why you were drawn. There's so many different things that you could be writing about and thinking about right now. There are so many challenges to civil liberties. I wondered why you wanted to focus right now in this moment on the court.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for being here, and it's a thrill for me to be in conversation with these brilliant thinkers and writers. I wanted to write this book because I believe at this moment that the U.S. Supreme Court is itself a threat to American democracy in some fundamental ways. As you mentioned, I run the Brennan Center. We work on voting rights and redistricting and a whole bunch of other issues. And I'd written these books on constitutional history. And it was quite clear a year before the 2022 June term ended that this new supermajority was something different, that the court had been trending to the right, but that now you had 6 votes moving more or less in lockstep, and that something big was going to happen. And in fact, in this first full year term, you saw in the end, it was predictable that it would be an important term. It wasn't predictable how cantankerous it would be, how much drama and scandal, how many leaks. And then in the last 3 days of June of 2022, you had first the Bruin decision, which was by far the most radical Second Amendment ruling in the country's history. Then the next day, the Dobbs decision, which, as you all know, overturned Roe v. Wade and Casey and a half century of protection for women's reproductive rights, and put at risk all these other privacy rights as recognized in the Constitution. And then in the third day, a case called West Virginia versus EPA, which marked the beginning of what is clearly a deep and broad assault on the ability of government to act to protect the environment and other things of that nature, all in 3 days. They crammed decades of social change into those 3 days. And so I wanted to understand how the court came to have so much power, how it came to be captured, in effect, by a faction of a faction, what it means for our democratic system, and what folks can do about it.
I think most folks are familiar with the idea that Roe v. Wade is overturned by Dobbs. Some folks understand that Bruin overturns, I think it's a century of precedent in gun ownership and gun regulation. But I'd like you to actually talk a little bit about the EPA decision, because I don't think that people have really focused on the impact of that decision and on the power this court, on the assault this court has now launched on the administrative state and the power of our executives to regulate and govern the entire country.
Well, and that one is unfolding. That one has really only begun. So the key year here is actually not 2022, but 1937. Up until that point, the conservative justices of that era, the Alitos of that time, felt that their job was to stop government from regulating the private economy. And this was when FDR had his big clash and conflict with the court, and he pushed court expansion, court packing, and his political coalition imploded as a result, but the court backed down. And from then on, it allowed the growth of a modern government in the United States, and I would argue a modern country that we live in. There were some people who thought that was a grievous mistake. They called it the Constitution in exile. Before he was appointed Chief Justice, John Roberts was identified as one of the people who in the New York Times, who felt that way. But it was not until this past year that a real effort to use constitutional or legal principles to curb the power of regulatory agencies and government itself to act in the economy really took root. Now, West Virginia versus EPA, the facts of the case were not so important, but what they said was they unveiled something, a new doctrine that they had never articulated before, called the Major Questions Doctrine, which said that even if Congress passed a law, that the text of which gave the EPA, in this case, the ability to take a certain action on climate change, it was such a major question that they couldn't do it. In other words, if the topic was...
Can you just say that again?
Yeah, and that's not a paraphrase.
The
That's
Congress of the United States made a big law, and it's such a big law that they can't do it.
If the problem is important enough to act, then that's when you can't act. And what that means, but it's very fuzzy and vague about what this Major Questions Doctrine is. What it means is that judges, these unelected judges and justices with lifetime appointments, decide which laws, which regulations are just so major that they are not allowed. And you're starting to see that in case after case, including in this most recent term. And they've taken more cases going forward that are going to continue, I don't know if chipping away, but sledgehammering away at this administrative state. And that is something that is going, I would imagine, to unfold in year after year and case after case going forward.
I'd like, Joan, to bring in your thoughts here, because I'd really encourage you to read these books together. Actually, I'd really encourage you to read all four of these together. I really enjoyed the interplay and the connections that I saw between and among the books. But Joan, your book really does something that I think all of us documentarians and authors dream of, which is gets inside the personal stories of the justices, the famously reclusive justices. And so I'd love to tell me particularly how you did that.
I do, thank you, Dawn. I do feel like my stock and trade is getting inside their world to try to understand it for what they are doing in such a substantial way. But first, I do want to thank the organizers and also just say that I've been asked to at least tell you about the death of a real friend of all that we're talking about up here, and also a friend of the Vineyard. Charles Ogletree has died, and he was represented so much for civil rights, represented so much in terms of trying to counteract the trajectory that the court has been on, and certainly was such an author and thinker that you all appreciated here. So I wanted to salute his memory at this moment. Many of us that were on panels just like this with Tree, as people called him, along the way. But how do I do it? I mean, I've been covering the court for about 30 years. To this crowd, I'm happy to acknowledge it. Sometimes I just kind of fuzz the number of decades. But I truly, going back to 1992, with the Washington Post, and actually right before then covering Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, where I first met Charles Ogletree. And I felt like what I could do through working on the books, just being on the beat long enough, was get to know the justices, their law clerks, and try to figure out why did they do what they do. Try to find when they've switched votes, what motivated them to switch votes, who was up, who was down. And when I started Nine Black Robes, I signed the contract in early 2020, before COVID, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still alive. And I thought what I was going to bring all of you was the inside drama of the Trump effect on the court, and how Chief Justice John Roberts suddenly had to recalibrate himself with each additional Trump appointee. But then what happened, as we all know, September 18th, when Justice Ginsburg passed away, and within weeks, this pending petition from Mississippi to try to defend its 15-week ban on abortion was before the justices. They suddenly take that case, they go further than they'd ever done with anything, and suddenly the story was far more overt. Far more overt. The drama was there in terms of what, just what Michael and all of you are aware of, the exterior story. And I appreciate, Dawn, you talking about how I have cultivated individuals who are in the Supreme Court orbit to find out what happens. It is not easy. It takes a lot of time. People get very mad. And every time I do a special project for one of my news organizations or one of these books, people always say, they'll never talk to her again. They'll never talk to her again. But somehow they keep talking to me. So, but I always knock wood, and I don't take anything for granted. And I do have to say, what happens is that people who, you look at what was once the middle of this court, Sandra Day O'Connor, my first biographical subject, Sandra Day O'Connor, and then Anthony Kennedy, and before them, Lewis Powell. There is no center. We have no center. And even though the chief and Justice Kavanaugh are, kind of by various metrics.
Justice Kavanaugh is the center.
Well, and he's not. Yes, and that's kind of the point, is that how could you think of someone who is very much to the right, being at the center of this court? But it just goes to show how much has changed. But it also goes to show how much my kind of work to figuring out who is up, who is down, who is actually motivating various people. For example, right now on that voting rights decision, when they did manage to preserve Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, a real surprise. Things like that is, what I try to get at.
I do want to bring in our other two. But I want to ask you both to comment on, I think, are we correct in being really concerned about how this court is making decisions? I mean, when I hear you say they've leaned on a new doctrine, that sounds to me like making shit up. So, I think sometimes you feel like you're kind of having this out-of-body experience, that you're not seeing what you're actually seeing. Is that what the justices are counting on? That there's, we'll say nothing to see here?
They do that. In fact, I was lucky enough to be in the courtroom for the big announcements at the end of this term. It was the first time since June of 2019 that they had read anything from the bench. And I just have to say, for my fellow journalists who usually are on a tight deadline and have to write off of what they see on the internet, I get to be there and listen to them. And when Chief Justice John Roberts overturned precedent going back decades on affirmative action, he did not acknowledge it. He did not acknowledge it from the bench or in his written opinion, as if, no, we're not overturning Bakke, no, we're not overturning Grutter versus Bollinger from 2003, and we're not overturning Fisher from 2016. And, I was sitting there saying, this cannot be right. And it fell to Clarence Thomas, who decided to voice his concurring opinion from the bench, saying, they just overruled everything. And Sonia Sotomayor saying, in her dissent, they just overruled everything. But the chief, just as you say, there's kind of like a nothing to see here, trust us mantra, that, as to use a line from Sonia Sotomayor, you're not fooling anybody.
And, some of this is the mystification that this court, and really any court, relies on to get the legitimacy with the rest of us to follow them as a court. I mean, one of the things I had the chance in doing this book, because I was working, we all benefit enormously from Joan's journalism. I was really basing what I was writing on the opinions and the external part of it. But looking at the history of this, the portion of the Constitution that creates the federal courts is 1/10 the length of the portions dealing with Congress and the presidency. This court only grew into the power and impact that it has over many years. And it has this singular role because we give it all this power, because we give it the power. And it has to be seen in some ways as a court. It has to be seen as in some ways not too extreme, too ideological. And it is a very political institution that has to, for its effectiveness, make sure we're not thinking about that all the time as we look at them. And one of the things I think that's important for all of us is these are government officials with lifetime tenure, but government officials. They're not wizards, even though they wear robes. They're not religious figures interpreting the oracles from the past, which is a lot of the kind of atmospherics around this embrace of originalism. They're government officials, and one of the consequences of the last few years, both how they're making the rulings, but also what the rulings are, is that public trust in the Supreme Court, by all measures of public opinion polls at least, has collapsed to the lowest level ever recorded. A lot more people are seeing them in a different light. An example of where they were seeming to act not as what we would regard as a normal court. A number of the cases this past June, they weren't really clearly the kind of case and controversy that is supposed to come before the Supreme Court.
You mean no real plaintiff?
Yeah, almost like advisory opinions. And again, we don't want this court to be doing that, or any Supreme Court, whether liberal or conservative.
I'd like to turn to Rachel, to your book. Many of you may have read in the New York Times or other places, which is where I first encountered this story, as Georgetown University's relationship to slavery. But when I remember distinctly reading the article and thinking, maybe this says more about me, but something like, oh, how unfortunate. And when I read those articles, I felt like they really minimized the actual story. After reading your book, Georgetown did not just have a relationship with slavery. It exists because of slave labor, of profits from the sale of human beings, and then this went on for decades. So I wonder if you could just tell us how you came to the story, and then I would really like you to comment on the earlier reporting, which I feel really did a disservice to this story. It is far more, they are far more culpable than I think the early reporting suggested. And so I would like to hear how you came to the story and comment on the other reporting.
Well, I'm thrilled to answer the question, and in part, I am both of those parts of the story. I am the early reporting and the book. So I can talk a little bit about the journey. So how did this come to be? It really was pretty serendipitous, and often journalism is this way. A colleague of mine got an email from a Georgetown alum, one of her sources, who happened to be a CEO of a tech company in Cambridge, who sent her an email saying, hey, there's an exclusive for the New York Times, a story about a slave sale in 1838 that benefited Georgetown. And she was intrigued, but uncertain, like, was a story about an 1838 slave sale a story? And you have to remember that this was back in January of 2016. The 1619 Project hadn't been written. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his case for reparations, the powerful article that ran in The Atlantic. But, we're a newspaper, and newspapers at the time mostly wrote about the here and now. And it's my great fortune that she didn't just delete the email. Instead, she sent it to me, and she sent it to me because she remembered I had written a book about Michelle Obama's enslaved ancestors. And so when I received the email, I knew immediately that it was a story. My first book allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families, and this I could see immediately would be the next step in exploring how slavery shaped a contemporary institution, an elite university, Georgetown. So that's how it came to be. And he actually had stumbled across it because students at Georgetown had demonstrated. They wanted the names of some of the buildings changed. And I don't know if they had those names when you were there, but the administration agreed to change the names of these buildings, which carried the names of 2 priests, early presidents who were involved in the sale. They did that. But again, this alum wondered, well, what happened to the people? 272 people were sold in 1838 to save Georgetown. And when he asked, he was told, a faculty member told him, oh, well, they all died. And he said, all of them? Nearly 300 people died? And so he got started just digging, and that's when he reached out to us. And so when those first stories ran, his nonprofit, he hired a team of genealogists, had identified about a handful of descendants. And the first story that ran had the headline, 272 slaves were sold to save Georgetown. What does it owe their descendants? And after writing that article and a number of articles, I started realizing that this was more than just about an 1838 slave sale. And this is just kind of journalism process. More than just about an 1838 slave sale. And it was more than just about Georgetown. It was about the Catholic Church. And what I learned in digging through the archives was that slavery, it wasn't just this 1838 slave sale. The Catholic priests who built the foundations of the Catholic Church and established Georgetown relied on slavery to build the very underpinnings of the church, the first archdiocese, the first cathedral, the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning. Priests who operated plantations established the first seminary, and Georgetown, which was the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning. So it took some time.
I wonder if what the reaction has been from the university to the book and to the evolving story. Do you think that the current faculty, president, were they aware of this history? Do you have a sense of what people knew and when they knew it?
So the interesting thing is that historians have known about this history. And in fact, even before students protested, even before I wrote my first article, Georgetown had established this working group to try and grapple with this history. But the story that is traditionally told about, how the Catholic Church emerged in the United States leaves out enslaved people. Georgetown, if you were to look at its description of itself, left out that history. And there is obviously a growing reckoning about that. Both Georgetown and the Jesuits, as well as a number of contemporary institutions now, are reckoning with this, even though, for those of us who do this research, there are obviously forces trying to stop this work from being done.
I wonder, you mentioned the work, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book about, his writing about reparations. Did your research change I don't know what your opinions are about reparations, if you want to share them, but I wonder what you think this research adds to that conversation.
I think that, it's again, if you kind of dial back the clock a bit to when the first articles ran in 2016, I could not have imagined that we would be having a policy debate about reparations, like real reparations happening in this country. Talking about Charles Ogletree, he was involved in some of those early lawsuits about reparations, and was a mentor and someone who really encouraged many of us who kind of do this work. But Georgetown in 2019 became the first major university to decide to create a fund to benefit the descendants of enslaved people who were sold and held in bondage to support the school. And the Jesuits established a foundation in partnership with descendants and has pledged to raise about $100 million to benefit racial reconciliation projects and descendant projects too. And it's not just them. As we know right now, there are municipalities, there are the state of California. So this work, I think, does have an impact. And again, we're in a period where there's both a lot of experimentation going on and a lot of headwinds.
I think one of the great contributions of this book, first of all, it's a beautifully written book, but something that was so moving to me is how much humanity you give to the enslaved people. In researching and telling their stories of people, because even when you say 272 people, that's probably more than the people that are in this room were sold, and they were separated from their families. Mothers, children, families were separated. And one of the things your book does is it forces you to confront the realities of the brutality of the system. So there's great detail about when the university is going bankrupt multiple times, it assesses the value of the human beings and decides where to sell them. And that's
right.
Separating parents and children. And I just wonder how that research affected you, reading about their stories and giving agency to their lives.
One of the, when you're looking at these letters, 19th century letters, first of all, my eyes are far worse than they were reading this 19th century script. But Archbishop John Carroll, looking at the debts of the plantations, there's a line where he says, okay, well, the way to deal with this is to sell 2 unnecessary Negroes. And that's how they dealt with it. But, when I was starting on this book, I was well aware that when you're talking about slavery, there are people who are going to say, stop, not interested, nothing to do with me, turn the page, not. So how do you get people to engage? How do you get people to hear? And I thought the story of a family. 272 people, I decided to tell the story of one family. And it's the Mahoney family. And their journey parallels the emergence of the Catholic Church and the emergence of the Catholic Church engagement with slavery. So there's a matriarch, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives as an indentured servant in the 1600s. So she's a black woman who has a contract. She thinks she's going to be freed. She's forced into slavery. Her contract is burned. She loses everything. But she has her story, and she tells that story to anyone who would listen. Our liberty was stolen. We should have been free people. And those descendants of hers resist. Some of them kill an overseer and are executed. Some of them take the Jesuits to court and sue them to get their freedom. Harry Mahoney, one of her descendants in the War of 1812, saves the church's money and garners a promise from the Jesuits that his family will never be sold, and that promise is broken during this 1838 sale. But it's also important, I think, for people to understand that this, again, is not just past, and that these families, after my articles ran in the New York Times, learned about their history, and the descendants of this Mahoney family has been intimately involved in pressing the institutions to grapple with its history. It is, I like to say, hard history. There's no way around that. But, it's also a story of family and faith and resilience. Because, like I said, these descendants, which numbered in the handful when I wrote my first story, they're now about 6,000. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So speaking of institutions, Kate, I really appreciated the literary device you used to tell the story, coming to the story of discrimination at MIT. But really, it's a broader story about discrimination against women. So could you just describe, how you decided to tell the story through Nancy's story?
Yeah, so my book is about Nancy Hopkins, who's a molecular biologist at MIT. Maybe, certainly in this sort of local area, people might remember her as the woman who, when Larry Summers in 2005 said women lack the intrinsic aptitude to do higher level math and science, Nancy was the one who stood up and said, stood up and walked out famously. There was quite a kerfuffle over that. So Nancy just intersects with history, the history of her field, of science, of higher education, and of the women's movement, really, in many interesting ways. So in 1963, when the book opens, she is in a lecture, a Bio 1 lecture, taught by James Watson. It's 4 months after he's won the Nobel Prize with Francis Crick for decoding the structure of DNA. It's also the same year that the Equal Pay Act has been passed. And Nancy is, when the book starts, she's looking for something to do with her life. She feels like, like many women of her generation, she thinks, I'm going to get married within the next 10 years, and I have to have my children by 30 because there's no, amniocentesis is not even a concept to her. But she thinks that I have 10 years to do this amazing thing, and what's the amazing thing I'm going to do? And she goes to this lecture, and she is just captivated by the promise of DNA, which again is still, the study of modern genetics is still in its infancy. So she goes goes and studies with Watson, and becomes a protege of his. And then 10 years later, she has married. Her husband has left her, so we see, sort of the how that was all going to work out. In 1973, she gets hired. She gets offers from, she has a new PhD, and she gets offers from Harvard Medical School and MIT. And she knows that she is being offered these jobs because it's the dawn of affirmative action. And universities, the federal government has said to universities, if you're going to take our money, you have to do more to hire women. But she is completely, unflummoxed by the idea of affirmative action. She considers herself an affirmative action baby, and she wouldn't have thought of it that way. But she's not troubled by this because she knows that she's a really good scientist and she's perfectly trained for this role. And she takes the job at MIT because MIT has this, it's also the dawn of the war on cancer. And MIT is the first university in the country to establish a center to understand the basic causes of cancer. So she thinks, this is science. All I have to do is do the work hard. I can win a Nobel Prize. I'm certain no one's going to question my abilities here because science is, she and the other women who are hired then believe that this is a pure meritocracy. And what I like to say is, between 1973, when she gets hired at MIT, and 1994, when she begins doing the work that ultimately leads her to join together with these other women and force MIT to admit in 1999, and I like to say 1999, not 59, that MIT is discriminating against women. And at the time, I should say, again, 1999, there were 197 tenured male professors at MIT in the School of Science and 15 tenured women. That's astonishing, the turn of a new century. So I just, Nancy, as I said, Nancy's story just intersects really well with this. What's so interesting too is to go through it, and again, it's my lifetime. But there's this one moment in 1980 when that's sort of it's a sort of a pivotal moment where a professor of genetics comes to Nancy and asks her to co-teach this big course on genetics with him, and she says great, because again, she's really confident in her abilities. She's an accomplished lecturer. And so he says, okay, great, I'll go tell the department head. So he goes and he tells the department head. And the department head says, no, we can't have that. He says, I know Nancy's a fantastic lecturer, but undergraduates will not accept information from a woman at the front of a lecture hall. 1980, and I will say 1980 was the year, we talk a lot now about how women are actually favored in higher education because women make up 60% of students on American campuses. And 1980 was the year when that flipped, when women began to outnumber men. So, but the idea of having a woman at the head of the classroom, actually knowing something, being the expert, that was too much. But Nancy, it's also, to me, what was hardest and most gratifying about this book was Nancy was explaining the arc of her development as a feminist, because she did not come at this as a feminist. She thought feminists were crazy, they were whiners, she didn't want to be one of those people, she just wanted to be a scientist. And in 1980, she is still at the stage where she doesn't think that's outrageous, I have to teach this course and I'm going to protest. She thinks, oh, thank God for Jean Brown, who protected me from embarrassment at the front of this lecture hall and, all these horrible evaluations. So the evolution, I thought, sort of mirrored the evolution of women in this country.
I do have to say, though, reading the book and again, I think much like Rachel's reporting and writing, one of the things that's so important that you do is spend so much time kind of building and allowing us to re-experience what culture was like for women. The overt, women are not smart enough. Yeah. they don't have the constitutional capability to engage in rigorous thought. I mean, these were things that were said to them, and without irony, you're going to leave and have a family. But I am still struck at how much of the vestiges of that culture remain.
Yeah.
I mean, I started high school in 1980, and the boys were preferenced. I was a kid who did well in math, and then suddenly, in sophomore year, I decided I couldn't do it anymore. Why did I decide? I was at the Bronx High School of Science. Why did I decide I couldn't do math anymore? And just went down a different path. So I wonder if you, experienced in writing this, if you felt some familiarity or recognition with some of the discrimination that they faced. Because I think it's hard truth. We don't like to think that we're still swimming in that. I wonder how much you think has changed and how much you think we still need to be cognizant of and recognize and call it out when we see it.
I absolutely agree that it was a journey, as they say, for me writing this book. But even early readers and my editor, they all went through this sort of cycle of reading the book, and you read Nancy's experiences and you hear her reaction to this in 1980, and you think, no, how can you do this? But then you start to become angry about it because you remember how it relates to something in your own experience. You think, oh my God, why did I put up with that? And so I think there is a lot of it is a happy ending, sort of ish, but there is a lot of headbanging and how could you let this happen? So how much has changed? There's a wonderful mathematician at MIT, Gigliola Staffellini, and she said to me, anything they can measure, they will fix. So one of the reasons that Nancy Hopkins' story and the story of the women at MIT really resonated with women around the country and around the world was that Nancy famously, to prove that she had less lab space and less office space than the men at MIT, she famously took a tape measure and measured every square inch of the building and found out that as a fully tenured professor, she had less space than men without tenure. So that was really important. But the second part of the story, and what was fresh to me at the time as a reporter in 1999, was that they were talking about something. They called it marginalization. And in the formal report they wrote, there was a woman named Lottie Balin who was an expert in management. Many of you know Bernard Balin. Her husband's a historian. And Lottie had studied since the 1960s. She'd studied the roles of men and women in the workplace. And she talked about, she called it 21st century discrimination, and she talked about unconscious bias, which at the time was a new concept. Nobody was talking about it. Really, the first big paper on unconscious bias is 1995. And so the women actually, this was a stride that was accomplished by this report, was talking about the subtle ways in which women are discriminated against. And one of the things they talked about in this report was that women, yes, there were women on campus, but they were tolerated, not welcomed or included. And I think that is where there is still this great divide, and that is the hardest problem. The difference now is that we have all heard so much about unconscious bias that I think most people think it doesn't exist, or they cured it in that workplace training you had, maybe. I'm done with that. And the reality is it still very much exists. So the story that I told about saying we're not going to trust information from a woman at the front of the room, I think that is true for college professors, for journalists, for lawyers. For doctors, who are you taking information from? Who do we consider the genius, right? And when you look at some of the new research, I'm fascinated by this, just the language that we use around the idea of genius or intellect. We are much more likely to use the word genius. Men and women alike are much more likely to think of a man as a genius. They look at the same resume, it has a man's name or a woman's name, they're more likely to think highly of the man's resume. I mean, this has been stuff that's been going on since at least the 70s when they first started measuring it, and it's still true. So I do think it's that problem. It's getting to this idea that women can be not just legislators, but they can also be president, right? So 60% of American college students are women, but when you look at the faculty numbers, it's only about 38%. And where women are concentrated are in the positions as lecturers or untenured professors.
Yeah. I want to invite audience members to ask if you have questions. I think that there's a microphone. There are microphones here. So if you want to make your way up, we have about a little less than 10 minutes if you want to ask a question. Oh, we have our first question.
Hi. Hi. I'm Jennifer from Chilmark. I have a question about reproductive rights. It seems to me that the goose was cooked as soon as we got this Catholic supermajority on the court, and that it seems like a clear violation of church and state and the Establishment Clause and all kinds of other things. And I wonder, is there litigation starting to bubble up along those lines?
Certainly, and we have right now pending the so many different cases, including the one over mifepristone, the pill that's coming back up. You know, the part of the two-part protocol for medication abortions. When it was cooked was, as I said, on frankly September 18th, 2020, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and having Amy Coney Barrett succeed her in such rapid fashion really changed everything. And one scene I open my book with is just how the justices were trying to figure out where Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh would be, because everyone knew kind of wherever the place that the other justices had staked out. And I have to say that the liberal justices at the time succeeding were Elena Kagan, Steve Breyer, and Sonia Sotomayor. They felt kind of tricked by things that Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh had said during the first arguments in the Texas case that preceded the Mississippi one. And I think what we've seen since then is there are little glimmers from those two justices, Justice Barrett and Kavanaugh, who sometimes will move over a little bit to the center, but who do not have the mindset for the center. So I do think what we're going to continue to see is more increased rollbacks of reproductive rights. I do think they will go slower this time because as much as 5 justices were all in on total reversal of Roe v. Wade, seeing what has happened since is sobering, especially for those who are very much attuned to politics. You know, the chief is essentially saying, I told you so. I told you so. Look what happened in 2022. We shouldn't have done it so fast. But I think that's something that also Brett Kavanaugh certainly keeps an eye to. So to answer your question about what next, there will be more cases as states continue to do what they're doing. But I think you won't see as much of the jolt that we saw in June of 2022.
Hi, I was at MIT in the late 60s, early 70s, doing a PhD. And when I was doing my PhD, I was told I was too pretty, and I would have babies, and I was taking the place of a man, and they would not remove that person from my PhD committee. So I studied so hard that he had to pass me. And it's interesting, I have a double degree and have been teaching at Tufts Dental School. And when I first started there, I got a very low salary, I won't mention what it was, with a PhD from MIT and a dental degree from Harvard and a postdoc from Harvard. So it was very interesting that it took 17 years before I got a decent salary, and it took a black dean to give me an endowed chair. And I'm now a distinguished professor and a dean of research, so I think finally women are being recognized for their abilities. So, but it's taken many generations.
Yeah, I guess I would say, and this is true of all forms of discrimination, what is the opportunity cost there? What have we lost that these women have to, you know, as you do, to persist like this, or that a woman has to spend all this time measuring her lab space instead of curing cancer? I mean, really? Like, can't we move beyond this? So anyway, congratulations. Thank you for your work.
Thank you for that. Come over here.
Going back to Justices Roberts and Thomas and Sotomayor, so which is the more concerning or the more dangerous? The Roberts who says we're not overturning Grutter, or Thomas and Sotomayor who call it like they think it is?
Well, I'll just add real quickly, Justice Sotomayor doesn't have the power. She's obviously, one of the minority justices right now. And Clarence Thomas, as much as the new Trump appointees have certainly embraced his ideology, still is not going to be controlling opinions as much because he's still kind of pushing more of a fringe idea in ways, even though he's got more votes. He's not going to be controlling things. I still think this is the Chief's court and that nobody should count him out for not just how he's going to rule, but also the spin about it.
But I would suggest a somewhat different analysis, at least from my perspective. When you look at the broad totality of the big rulings in the last few years, these are rulings that have landed where Clarence Thomas was over many years, and he was utterly on the fringe of the court, both in the way he embraced a very, very rigid originalism, his views on the Second Amendment, his views on affirmative action, which other justices shared. And certainly he wasn't the only one who one could have anticipated would overturn Roe v. Wade. I will note that the only justice, I looked at all the confirmation statements made by the justices in their confirmation hearings, because once a while ago it was very euphemistic. It was all about the right to privacy. In recent years, it was very explicitly about Roe v. Wade. And the recent justices were very lawyerly in their response, and that while they gave emanations and noises that made you think, well, they respected precedent and they would not overturn this, if you actually read what they said, they didn't say that at all. There was only one justice who pretty clearly misled the Judiciary Committee on this topic, Justice Thomas, who testified under oath that he had never discussed Roe v. Wade and had never expressed an opinion on it, even though he was in law school at the time it came down. So I think that the gravitational pull, to me at least, on the court as a general matter, he has had a huge impact given how far off to the side he was for most of the time he was on there.
Hi, my name is Don Barger, and I have to tell you that this was a terrific eye-opening experience for me, and I now know what my children and grandchildren are going to be getting for their next gift. But my question is serious. We are under a lot of pressure for censorship. One of you did say there is pushback with women, I think that was what it was, about getting published. My question is, considering all of the crazies in, well, I won't say where they're from, okay, but considering that, how much of a risk are we that I'll go to the local library and try to check out one of these books and it'll be banned?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think for many of us who do work on inequality and where things are in this country, we know that history is a battleground right now. And, books are being banned. The teaching about race and about slavery is under assault. And, when I started work on in those first articles about Georgetown and slavery in the Catholic Church, it felt urgent. It feels even more urgent now. And this kind of work is just so important. And we're seeing it in all of our libraries and bookstores. Kate, you were about to say something. No. Yeah. So I think it's a really important question, and it means that the work is more important than ever.
Yeah, I think we're going to take our last question. But one of the things that you can do is, when Nancy says if you measure it, you can see it. And I think the work of these authors, what they're doing is measuring it. They're giving us the data to refute falsehood. And so by supporting their work and sharing it with your children, with your grandchildren, with your friends, with anyone who you love, you help combat. Really, it's fascism, it's tyranny. You help combat that. So you will have our last word, our last question.
It plays off of something Michael said, where he said the court has the power that we give it. And so I wanted maybe quick responses from not just Michael, but from all of you on how we take that power back.
Maybe this is not surprising from a journalist. I think we continue to tell stories. I just think the more we talk, the more people. This is how marginalized groups have become less marginalized. It is making their stories known, and when it's much harder to hate up close. I guess is what I would say.
In addition to that, in addition to the broad backlash that's brewing, there are reforms to the Supreme Court itself that could make a difference. We all see the reasons for the court having a binding code of ethics. They're the only court in the country that doesn't have it. Nobody is so wise that they should be the judge in their own case. And I think there ought to be 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. Nobody should have too much public power for too long. George Washington taught us that when he stepped down from the presidency after 2 terms. And this is, interestingly, a very popular idea across the political spectrum. I think it's an idea whose time has come eventually.
I would say, continue to be engaged, continue to ask questions, continue to, when you read something, continue to be informed and to ask about that. And I'd say that has to do with kind of what you read in the media or what you hear on TV, but also in terms of history, too. I think a lot of us have, taken for granted, that what's in the textbooks must be what's true. But as journalists, we always ask, whose voices aren't being heard? Which stories aren't being told? And I think as public, as an enlightened public, we need to, all of us, ask those questions.
And just finally, I would say that 2 things. One is you have access to everything the court is doing. You can read the opinions. You can see what they're doing. And so I would encourage you to actually get those online. You can get those. But then I would also say, to salute our moderator, Dawn has a fabulous documentary coming out on the Supreme Court. So just as much as you read and watch, read our books, watch her, and see the consequences as they played out as Kate and Rachel documented them.
Thank you.
Well, this is a fantastic morning. Thank you for the shout out. September 22nd, Paramount Plus with Showtime. Thank you so much for all of you being here. For all
Thank you. One sec. Thank you. Someone lost their keys, a keychain.